Hello and welcome. In today's video I'm going to look into the important problems and questions that people might have with the Double-T grid and the Double-T junction. So if you've seen these ideas before and you thought, that's an interesting idea but it's not going to work out because of this problem or because of that problem, then this could be the video for you. I've been thinking about these ideas for a while now, and I do think there are solutions to all of the major and most of the minor problems. But I'm just one guy and I'm not an expert in almost everything, and this is just one video. So let me know if I've gotten anything wrong, if I've missed a potential problem, or if there are even better solutions than the ones I present here. With any potentially transformative new idea, there are always possible problems and drawbacks, and if people don't get a handle on the possible downsides early on, then they may develop unrealistic expectations and ultimately end up disappointed. Also, it would be impossible to cover everything in detail in one video, but at the very least, I want to bring the ideas and concerns out into the open. At the same time though, I don't want to undersell this idea. I thought these ideas were a bit wacky at first, but I was intrigued, so I started experimenting. After a while, I got into a bit of a pattern where I would try something out, find a problem, get a bit disheartened, and then find a way around the problem, and then try the next thing, and so on. Eventually, I got to the point where I think it just works, and works really well, but with some conditions and limitations. This is an idea that will seem very counterintuitive to many people, I think. It turns a lot of what people might think about traffic and road networks upside down. So I'm going to try to give multiple different explanations for things where it's useful. And I think that will help people build up their own idea about how these new ideas work. There's quite a lot to get through in this video, so I'm going to break it down into these different sections. But feel free to jump around, but just to warn you that some sections do build on the previous ones, so you might have to jump back to get the full picture. Now, I'm not really going to cover the basics of the Double-T junction and Double-T grid in this video. I have some introductory videos that cover all of that kind of thing, so I'm just going to jump straight into some of the more advanced concepts. First, I want to quickly mention the uptake or adoption levels for these ideas. These ideas are not an all or nothing concept. There are graduated levels as to the extent that they might be used in the real world. First then, we have a no adoption level. This is where I must have missed some big problem with these ideas, and that means nobody is going to use them, ever. The second level then is where a town or a city could make use of a few isolated Double-T junctions here and there to improve traffic flow in a few specific areas. After that, we have a level where a city could use a Double-T grid in a small area or section of a city. For the next level, we could have a hybrid citywide grid that would blend a conventional one-way system with a Double-T grid across a large city area. Finally then, we have a total grid replacement level. This is where we convert every intersection that we can to a Double-T junction within a city. In this video, I'm going to be mostly talking about the implications of the last level here, where a city will use a Double-T grid on every street that is relevant for traffic flow. I'm not saying though that this is the approach that every city should take, but I think that developing these ideas to its fullest extent is going to be the best way to explain these ideas and to tease out the various problems that can arise. So, with that in mind, and before I get to the various problems, I want to quickly cover some of the main benefits. The first benefit for me is that drivers will spend less time waiting at traffic lights. Because cars do not cross the path of other cars at intersections, the traffic light can remain green the majority of the time. They would only turn red for pedestrians. I'll walk through the full details of this in my grid analysis video, but for a typical intersection, the average waiting time at a traffic light would go from an average of about 12 seconds that you would have at a normal one-way intersection to less than 1 second for a Double-T junction. Now, every real-life city is different, of course, and these values are just some typical ones I arrive at by assuming a green light time of 1 minute for traffic and 10 seconds for pedestrians. The conventional one-way system will, of course, have to split that green light time for traffic between two different directions, but the Double-T junction doesn't. The next benefit is that you can get where you need to go in less time. This benefit, of course, follows from the previous one, but it might not be clear to people just how much having a lower average stop time can impact overall journey times. Here on screen I have a car making a similar journey in a one-way system on the left and a Double-T grid on the right. And the car stops for the average amount of time for a traffic light stop at every intersection. It should be pretty clear which car is going to get to their destination first. The next main benefit of the Double-T Junction and Grid is the increased traffic throughput. And again, in this video, I'm going to look at it in a different way. So a different way to think about this increased traffic throughput is to say that the traffic throughput of a 2-lane Double-T junction is roughly the same as that for a 4-lane one-way intersection. So if you think about it, both intersections stop for a few seconds for pedestrians to cross the intersection, but when the traffic has the green light, 4 lanes of traffic proceed through the intersection at a time. Now the one-way intersection has an advantage in that some traffic won't need to slow down to go around a corner, but on the other hand it has the disadvantage that one of the directions has to slow down and stop while the other direction gets a green light and starts to move again. So roughly speaking, the traffic throughput would be quite similar. Another benefit of the Double-T junction, I think, is safety, but that's going to take a bit of explaining, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. One thing I didn't mention in the analysis video is that if people can get where they want to go more quickly, that also means that they're going to be off the road more quickly, and so they won't be able to hold up other road users, and those road users in turn won't be able to hold up the next road users, and so on. In effect, we've replaced the vicious cycle of traffic gridlock with a virtuous cycle. Now that's great, but there's a downside to this in that if a city already suffers from gridlock, if you improve the road network, you could end up encouraging more people to drive, or perhaps they will consider making journeys that they would not have considered before. So this leads me to the first of the disadvantages, and that is induced demand. Now, this is a whole subject on its own, and I have no chance of doing it justice in one video. So if you're interested in this concept, there are a few sources that you should check out, and I'll try to remember to add a few links in the description. But briefly then, yes, this is a real problem, and the basic gist of it is that if you increase the capacity of a road, you can inadvertently induce or encourage more people to drive in it, and that makes traffic worse again, and you end up back where you started. Now, there are a few things to keep in mind when looking at the problem of induced demand, and the first is that if you look into the problem in depth, you'll find that most of the cited examples of induced demand are usually about highway widening, and there just aren't any examples of wide-scale city improvements that can compare to a Double-T grid. The next point could, depending on your perspective, be considered a problem for the Double-T grid, and I have a section on it as a problem later on. But here it can be considered a benefit, and that's the interface to the Double-T grid. So Double-T grids are going to be finite. They will end at a certain point, which is where they meet a different traffic system. A conventional two-way road, say, will have to interface with the one-way Double-T grid. And depending on how these interface roads are configured, it's likely that these conventional feeder roads will not have the traffic capacity to feed in enough traffic to the Double-T grid to cause it problems. So this interface has the potential to act as a gateway to the Double-T grid. And I've got more details on this later. Now, even keeping all these points in mind, though, induced demand can still be a problem. But that's potentially true of any road improvement works. It's just something that always has to be considered and planned around. Getting back to the question of safety now. Safety is very important when it comes to any kind of road alteration work. Generally speaking, and I should note I'm not an expert on traffic safety, city planners will only implement changes to a road network if it results in a safer road network. Okay, so to start off then, we have to ask ourselves, are our existing intersections safe? And the answer is no, not at all. Most of the serious and severe traffic accidents occur at intersections. There have been plenty of studies to back this up. So why is this? Well, if you see a graphic of the possible vehicle-to-vehicle collision points at intersections, you can see why. There are many different ways collision can occur at a conventional intersection. And of these possible collisions, things like head-on and T-bone collisions are considered the most harmful. Now, if you look at the possible conflict points for a Double-T junction, you can see that the possibility of having many of these collisions are essentially eliminated. Now that's awesome, but these diagrams probably make the unmodified Double-T junction look much safer than it would be in the real world. That's because they assume that vehicles stay in their lanes, and the Double-T junction has two roads with traffic approaching each other from opposite directions, which, in its default configuration, would not really be safe at all. So, to stop the possibility of serious accidents, we would need to build some type of barrier to stop cars from leaving their lane while passing through a Double-T junction. With the right barriers in place, you will of course still get vehicle-to-infrastructure accidents, as well as types of vehicle-to-vehicle collisions like rear endings. But it will eliminate the possibility of the most damaging types of collisions between two vehicles. But wait a minute, am I trying to pull a fast one here? Won't using a Double-T junction mean that we'll be increasing the number of times cars will have to change lanes between intersections? I've got more on this idea later on, but for now, are we just moving the points of collision from the intersection area to the roads between intersections? Well, yes and no. Between the intersections, we will have one-way roads, so the vehicles on these roads are all travelling in the same direction, going at similar, relatively low city speeds. So any collisions that do occur will tend to be much less damaging to vehicles and the people inside those vehicles. Overall then, including the intersections and the roads between them, it should still result in safer roads for drivers. What about the other aspect to safety, pedestrian safety? Well, it should be safer for them too, but that's a bit more complicated, and I've got a section dedicated to that later on. So, if the Double-T grid can lead to more free-flowing traffic with shorter red light signal times, shorter average journey times, and higher throughput roads and intersections, along with improved safety, what is stopping us from transitioning to this new grid configuration? Well, as I see it, it's going to come down to people, and these people are going to have a few different reasons. The first reason I'm going to look at is resistance to change. This, for me, is a fuzzy psychology type topic that I have basically no chance of doing justice to in a short time. So, to keep actual experts in this field from cringing too much, I'll just mention a few points and move on. Boiling it down then, some or many people get stuck in their ways and they don't like to change. Change would mean having to learn new things, and learning is hard. And in the case of these new ideas in particular, having some expert telling them that they have to learn some brand new concepts and skills just for the privilege of continuing to do something they've been doing just fine for years and years, that might not be an easy task. As an aside though, I'm mentioning this point because this topic is one of the reasons for this whole video. I'll get to the other reasons later, but I want to give these new ideas a chance to survive. To do that, I'm gonna try to get answers for most of the questions and criticisms that I think people will inevitably throw at these new ideas in order to dismiss them, thinking that this will make their lives easier. So the problem I face at the moment is that there's a lot of subtleties to these ideas, and explaining the answers before the questions are even asked is difficult, but I'm going to give it a good try. Getting back on track then, how do we convince change-resistant people to change? Well, there's a few different approaches. Now, this first approach involves a number of different steps. Well, first, we explain that things are Actually, not fine at the moment. They're quite bad, and they're predicted to get even worse. Congestion is costing cities a lot of money every year, and the average speeds of cars is declining year on year. Next, we offer a better alternative. We show people that there is another way to do things that does have inherent advantages. Then we empathize. We tell them that yes, we know that this would be a major change. People will have to modify the way they go from A to B. It's going to take some effort, but the powers that be understand the difficulty and will try to make things easier. Then we respond. We have answers for the questions that they have and the concerns that they're going to bring up. Finally, then we alleviate. We acknowledge that there will still be some hardships, but we know about them and we're doing our best to consider them. Then there's the alternative approach, and that's a bit simpler. It's money. It's pretty obvious, of course, that money is a great motivator, not just for individuals, but also for small and large companies. So we just explain to the impacted companies that they could save time. And that means they could either save money or use the time saved to make more money. What further barriers to adoption might we find? I'm going to label this one general confusion. Because these ideas take an extremely common and mundane phenomenon like two roads intersecting, something everybody has seen and experienced countless times, and just turns what you think you know on its head, I think this will leave some people a bit bewildered. So they might get hung up on some initial problem they have with the Double-T Junction or Grid and not be able to move on to the more advanced ideas. I think the reasons for this will probably boil down to two different problems they might have. To say that people are used to being able to go straight ahead at each and every intersection they arrive at is an understatement. It's completely ingrained and embedded in people's brains. And the second thing is that people might get stuck on how to navigate in a Double-T grid. How do you get where you want to go if you can only go left or right? I think the most efficient way to get around these types of problems is to explain these concepts from a few different perspectives. So if somebody has a problem understanding these ideas, then hopefully one of these alternative perspectives will resonate with them and allow them to get past the block they're having, and they will get to the point where they realize that these problems are not really problems at all. As a bonus, even if you understand the concepts, you can still gain new insights from seeing these ideas in a different way. The first thing I think we can do is explain that at its core, this is just an alternative one-way system. Here we have a standard one-way system with half of the streets running the length of the city from east to west and the other half from west to east, and the same for north-south. Now, first we can shift half of the east-west streets down, and then we can move half of the north-south streets across, and the same for the other directions. We end up with exactly the same number of streets again, and the balance of the streets is exactly the same. So we have exactly the same number of northbound streets as we had before, and the same for the other directions. The difference is we've replaced our conventional intersections where the lights are red most of the time with the nice, new, rarely red Double-T junctions. The next alternative perspective, then, is that if you look down at the Double-T grid from overhead, it can be viewed as a system for circling a city block freely. That means the traffic runs clockwise around half of the city blocks and counterclockwise around the other half. When you're driving then, if you're circling one city block, you change lanes and circle the neighbouring city block. This perspective then leads directly to another one that I'll mention briefly, and that is that you could look at the city blocks as a type of roundabout, where the buildings are in the roundabout itself. Now, if you don't see this straight away, check out this video of an octagonal city grid. It's kind of a halfway house between a roundabout-based city and a Double-T grid. I've got a whole video on these alternative types of city grids, so check that out if you want to see more. So this city blocks or roundabouts concepts might help some people out with understanding these ideas, but it could scare other people off. And I think that's probably down to city navigation. Some people might think that navigating a Double-T grid might involve circular mental gymnastics and intricate forward planning just to make a simple journey. But these people are really overthinking the problem, because navigating a Double-T grid is actually quite easy and does not require any forward planning. Put simply then, when a driver is faced with a choice of turning left or right, they just need to choose the option that brings them closer to their destination. So let's look at that in more detail. Before I delve into this topic, I first need to point out that SatNav will still work just fine in a Double-T grid. It's just a collection of one-way roads, and SatNav should have no problem with it. So another way of saying that no forward planning is required is that a driver should try to mimic the direct as the crow flies route as much as they can. I'll walk through an example. Here we have a starting point and an end point for a trip that we'd like to make across a city. Now we can see the direct or as the crow flies version of the journey, which is what we would do if we didn't have to worry about buildings or roads. So we start here, and moving along this one-way street, we then get a choice of left or right. Clearly left in this case gets us closer to our destination, and it's closer to the direct route, so we take left. Then at the next intersection, we get the same left or right choice again, and this time taking a right gets us closer to our destination, so we take that. Then at the next intersection, left is the better choice again, so we take that, and so on. Then we're faced with a choice. Left or right are equally good options, so we can pick either, so say left this time. Then after a few more easy choices, we're faced with another equal choice again, so we'll pick right this time. We go around the city block then, and we reach our destination. So there's a lot to unpick in that demonstration. Firstly, moving diagonally across a city seems very quick and easy. Secondly, moving in what used to be a straight line seems like it would take longer than it would with a traditional city grid, but let's look at that in some more detail. So, if a journey across a city is going to be longer in terms of distance, then surely it's going to take more time, right? Well, no, and the reason why is down to the traffic lights at Double-T junctions. Back to my simplified city model again. See my grid analysis video for more details, but if we compare a one-way system on the left with a Double-T grid on the right, we can see that if we stop a vehicle for the average amount of time at each traffic light, at 12 seconds for the one-way system and about a second for the Double-T grid, then despite the extra distance, we can still get across the Double-T grid more quickly. Now there is of course a lot more to this issue, things like rectangular city blocks, synchronized green wave traffic light systems and hybrid grids, and so on. So check out that analysis video if you want that kind of detail, but for now I'll move on. Now there is of course another issue here, that you might have to use extra fuel to cover that longer distance, but that's a more complicated issue than it first looks, and I'll talk about that a bit later as well. But at the moment I want to look at how much longer these journeys are going to be. We can get a quick estimate for the distance involved using the model I made for the grid analysis video. So for a medium length journey in a city, on average, the journey in the Double-T grid would be about 37% longer than in a two-way traffic system, or about 25% longer than in a conventional one-way system. But like I said, more on this later. And that leads me on to the next section about the various issues around driving in a Double-T grid. Now, it took a while for me to learn the ins and outs of a Double-T grid and what it might be like to drive around in them. And like in many things, I learned the most from my failures. So, my first failure was thinking that having more lanes can be better. In this city here, I went from 2-lane roads, which were working perfectly well, to 4-lane roads to see if I could improve things even more. But it actually just made things worse, as you can probably see. Now this is a relatively straightforward simulation, and even when I did things like stopping traffic from crossing more than one lane at a time, or giving them more opportunities to change lanes, it only slightly improved the situation. So what exactly is the problem here? Well, I misunderstood the effect of shortening the traffic light stops. With a conventional one-way intersection, the lights are red for vehicles more than half the time, so most of the time, with a 4-lane road, those 4 lanes just work as a buffer. temporarily storing traffic while it waits for the lights to turn green. The roads in the Double-T grid stop vehicles much less often, so the idea of having a traffic buffer is much less useful. Besides, a two-lane Double-T junction has pretty much the same traffic throughput as a conventional four-lane one-way intersection. So, how can having more than two lanes actually make the traffic worse? Well, there's three different factors at play here. The first is that when you have three lanes or more, not only does a driver need to check that there's free space in the next lane, you also need to check that nobody else is trying to move into that space from the other side. Next, instead of everybody sensibly changing lanes just one at a time, you're always going to get people who wait until the last minute and try to cross three lanes in a single maneuver. Finally, and most importantly, having more than two lanes greatly increases the total number of lane changes that will need to be made. In a Double-T grid, vehicles are going to need to change lanes at roughly every second city block. So adding an extra lane or two can double the number of lane changes that need to be made. And if the city blocks are not long enough to support that number of lane changes, then things start to go wrong. More on this later. So simulations are one thing, but if a new type of grid requires more lane changes, then this could put some drivers off. There are some key differences, though, between the type of lane changes that drivers are used to and the lane changes they will have to make in a Double-T grid. When you change lanes on a highway, there is a potential for much greater speed differences between vehicles. These high speeds cause most drivers to be more cautious because of the potential for more dangerous collisions. And with multi-lane highways, drivers also need to worry about another driver moving to the same spot from the other side. Then with city driving, drivers will be familiar with situations where two lanes have to merge into one lane and the problems that can arise. The situation in a Double-T grid is different though. When a driver moves from the right lane to the left lane, there's an equal chance of there being a driver moving from the left lane into the right lane, so the lane changes tend to balance out. The other point is that yes, it can be hard to change lanes into a lane that isn't moving, but the traffic lanes in the Double-T grid tend to keep moving. So, with the increased lane switching in a Double-T grid, how can we make it easier on drivers? Well, the first thing we do is we limit the number of lanes to 2, and this is probably the most effective thing that can be done. The next thing, though, is to reduce the differences in speed between vehicles. Small differences in speed are fine and probably beneficial, but having a large difference in speed can make it more difficult to change lanes easily, so we might need to give some consideration to things like speed limits and how slow-moving vehicles are handled. Visibility is another issue. If drivers can see the vehicles that are turning onto the next street at the same time as them, they can get an idea of their speed, and then they can plan their lane changes before they've even gotten onto the street. On the other hand, if visibility is restricted, drivers will tend to slow down and be overly cautious, which isn't good for traffic flow. The last point, I think, deserves a section on its own, and that's having enough space and time to change lanes easily. This is another important consideration when it comes to the Double-T junction and Double-T grid, so it's time I started talking about it. Put simply then, drivers will need enough space and time between Double-T junctions to change lanes safely. So how much space is needed, and is this going to be a problem? And if so, where might it be a problem? And also, is there anything we can do about it? A lot of questions there, so let's break it down. To start with, do we have any real-world examples of these types of lane switches already? Specifically, are there any examples of two-lane roads where up to half of the traffic in both lanes need to switch lanes in a relatively short distance? Well, that situation does arise in cities occasionally, but I've yet to see any that have a similar traffic light profile to the Double-T junction, where the traffic light has a green light 90% of the time. So the roads are not at a full stop most of the time. So if the roads are free-flowing 90% of the time, are there any similarities to other types of roads? On the surface, there might look like there are similarities with a cloverleaf intersection, so is there anything we could learn from that? Well, not really. To start with, the lane switching profiles are very different. In a cloverleaf, all of the traffic merging onto the highway wants to switch lanes, whereas only some of the traffic on the highway wants to leave. Then there's the speeds and accelerations involved. The Double-T grid will have fairly consistent speeds, but the cloverleaf junction is a mix of low speeds, high speeds, and some vehicles try to accelerate into a lane where the traffic is trying to maintain a constant speed, but other traffic is trying to slow down. So, because this traffic arrangement doesn't seem to actually occur anywhere in the real world at the moment, I can't get any real world numbers for how much space is needed. And it's not that simple. It's not just a case of saying how much distance we need between Double-T junctions. It's really a case of what distance can support what level of traffic. Now, to start to even make a guess at how much space is needed, first we need to think about all of the other factors that could impact the amount of space that is required. So, things like city speed limits will have a big effect. And of course, there's also the extent at which the speed limits are actually obeyed, which of course is going to vary from city to city. Then there's the profile of the vehicles, like what percentage of the vehicles are slower on average or perhaps slower to accelerate. Then there's the road conditions, weather conditions, and visibility. They'll also have an effect. And the final thing is the level of traffic, basically how many vehicles are actively driving at the time. Now, this one is important for a few different reasons. Firstly, how does the traffic level affect grid performance? With conventional one-way systems, we can measure how they perform, and we can do this by measuring how many cars are using the roads at a time, and graphing that against another metric like the average vehicle speed. There are other metrics, but I'm just using this as an example. If we draw a graph then, we usually see that as the number of vehicles on the roads increases, the average speeds of those vehicles decreases fairly gradually. But at a certain point, the effect of adding more new vehicles to the road has the knock-on effect of reducing the average speeds more dramatically, and the road network heads rapidly towards total gridlock. So this type of graph can tell us a lot. It tells us how the road network handles increasing levels of traffic, it tells us the road network's optimal capacity, and it tells us how badly the traffic situation degrades once that optimal capacity has been exceeded. Now, Double-T grid is quite different from existing systems. It favours having just 2 lanes of traffic, but the traffic lights are green most of the time, and drivers lose the ability to block intersections. But it's still going to have a traffic capacity curve something like this one. But all of the lines and curves will be in different places. The average speeds will decrease at a certain rate, it will have a different optimal capacity, and once overloaded, the average traffic speeds will also begin to degrade at a certain rate. So why can't I give an estimate of the curve for a Double-T grid? Well, the thing is, it's just so completely different to existing traffic systems. The key factor in a conventional system is usually the intersection capacity, and that's determined by the traffic light system behavior. But in the Double-T grid, the most important factor is the driver's ability to switch lanes easily, and that's not something that existing traffic simulations have focused on modeling completely. For any simulation I've seen, the simulated drivers seem for me to be too efficient at changing lanes, more so than real drivers would be, so I'm not comfortable with sharing my overly impressive vehicles per minute simulated results. So what exactly is needed here? How do we get an idea of what the traffic capacity curve will look like for a Double-T grid? Well, first we need to get some hard data about how lane switching will work in a Double-T grid, and to do that, what we really need is some experimentation. What we could do is we could try to recreate the layout of Double-T grid on a small scale, put some volunteer drivers in it, and get some results. This could be done in a few different ways. Anything from marking out a large car park with traffic cones and simulating a single street of a Double-T grid, all the way up to temporarily converting some city blocks in a real city to a Double-T grid. Once we have the road set up, we would need a representative sample of different drivers and vehicles. Then to get some meaningful results, we could allow extra drivers to be added, and then we would see what point the traffic flow starts to degrade. Finally then, we could try altering some other variables and seeing the effects that they would have. In particular, varying the amount of space that drivers have to switch lanes and the effect that that would have. We could also try modifying things like the speed limit and see its effects. Now, with some work, we could start to come up with some hard numbers as to how much distance we need between Double-T junctions and what distance supports what level of traffic. Without real-world numbers then, I'm going to have to speculate and guess where not having enough space to change lanes might be a problem. Well, every city is different, of course, and I'm trying to keep this video as general as possible, but from what I've seen, cities that use rectangular city blocks are the ones that would be most likely to run into this problem. If the short edge of the rectangle is too short, then there won't be enough room for drivers to be able to switch lanes easily, and without being able to switch lanes easily, the traffic conditions will start to degrade. There are some workarounds, though, for grids that might look like they don't have enough space between intersections. And again, I go into more detail on this in my grid analysis video. But what you could do is factor some of the streets out of the Double-T grid, creating effectively more square city blocks with enough space to switch lanes easily. I'm not saying we delete the streets in real life, we just disallow through traffic on those streets and use them for a different purpose. So overall, that's some of the questions I asked earlier in this section answered, but others I can't answer right now without doing some experiments. So this is another one of the motivations behind this video, to shine some light on the gaps in my knowledge and hopefully inspire others to run some experiments to fill in these gaps. Needless to say, I don't have the personal resources to facilitate these kinds of experiments. Besides, it would probably be better if this kind of experiment was done by unbiased and independent third parties. For me, that's probably the biggest open question about a Double-T grid, but I want to have a look at some of the other open questions before I move on. To start with, back to something I mentioned earlier, that using the Double-T grid, we can have shorter journeys in terms of time taken, but longer in terms of distance travelled. Now, does that mean journeys will use more or less fuel? Well, on the more fuel used side, you have that some journeys will be longer in distance and will involve having to make more turns. And on the other side, you have that journeys will on average take less time, and there should be a lot less stop-start driving. But then we have a bunch of other variables. The biggest variable for fuel efficiency is of course going to be the level of traffic or the amount of congestion. Conventional one-way systems do reasonably well up to a point, but then the road starts to get congested and average speeds drop, and fuel efficiency, of course, will take a big hit. But then we also have variables like city speed limits and a thing called the corner radius. Now, I'll get into more detail about this later, but with a higher corner radius, turns are more gentle and cars can carry more speed around a corner. And with a lower corner radius, turns are sharper and cars can carry less speed around corners. Finally, there are a lot of issues that are going to be down to individual cities. Things like the shape of a city block, the types of roads, the shape of the cities themselves, and the predominant traffic routes. So with all these variable factors, it would be really hard to give a definitive answer at the moment. My feeling, though, is that congestion levels are going to be critical. If we can reduce those congestion levels and reduce the gridlock, then overall fuel usage should drop dramatically. Next then, clearly a Double-T grid will need new and different road signs. Now, I'm not sure about what form they would take, and I have a few ideas of course, but I don't want to advocate for any particular approach. I'm just going to shed some light on a few of the different options and propose a few ideas. So what is the issue with direction signs in a Double-T grid? Well, they get a bit messy. Now, let's look into this a bit more. Say we're at this starting point here, and we want to visit a famous landmark over here. And we want to direct drivers there with signposts. Well, we probably won't want to put a signpost at every turn the driver is going to make. That's just too many signs. So can we put all of the information on a single sign? Well, yes, but as I said, it gets a bit messy. We could also invent a shorthand to make things a bit easier, but it's still far from perfect. And that's for a route without any options. How do we describe routes with multiple equally valid options? So because of this, and with the lack of traditional road hierarchy, it might be worth considering descriptive signs instead of prescriptive. Now, what do I mean? Well, a prescriptive sign tells the driver what to do to get to their destination. A descriptive sign, on the other hand, will tell a driver where their destination is and leave it up to the driver to work out how to get there. Next, I'll move on to public transport. So the Double-T grid really only affects surface public transport. Things like trains and underground systems are barely going to change. Also, although the Double-T system can potentially free up road space for things like new tram systems and dedicated bus roads and bus lanes, I'm going to try to keep this discussion as general as possible and stick to just talking about bus routes in a Double-T grid. Now I'll give an example. Say we have these two bus routes in a conventional one-way system. If we tried to replicate these routes in a Double-T grid, we would get something like this. First glance, these routes look like they would be much slower, but that's not necessarily the case. If we simulate the effects of reducing our average traffic light stop times in a Double-T grid, we see that even these roundabout routes can work out to be faster. But we can do much better. In terms of the as the crow flies distance, diagonal routes are the most efficient in a Double-T grid. So it would be a better idea to replace the existing bus routes with something like these, if it's possible. Speaking of buses, I think it's worth mentioning that with a Double-T grid, we really need to be careful to keep the bus stops themselves out of the active traffic lanes. So I mentioned this already, that a 4-lane traditional one-way intersection will have a comparable traffic throughput to a 2-lane Double-T junction. That's great for the Double-T grid, but it does mean that we need to be much more careful about how we treat those lanes. So why is that? Well, if we have 4 lanes and we take 1 lane out of action for whatever reason, we decrease our traffic capacity by 25%. But if we have a 2-lane road and we take 1 lane out of action, we decrease our traffic capacity by 50%. So losing a single lane has a greater impact in a Double-T grid than it might have in other traffic systems. With the Double-T grid then, we would need to be more careful about keeping the traffic flowing. And that means keeping bus stops, taxi stands, delivery bays off of the main traffic lanes. Also, things that can take a traffic lane out of action for a longer time, like roadworks, would need to be considered and planned carefully. I've mentioned a lot of different road users so far, but I haven't mentioned cyclists or e-scooter enthusiasts yet. So, at first glance, it might look like these road users have nothing to gain from a Double-T grid, and they could even lose out because these types of road users would be more sensitive to covering longer distances than motorized vehicles. But it doesn't have to be bad news. Firstly, because the Double-T grid uses road space more efficiently, it may be possible to dedicate more space to these types of road users. That could, for example, mean turning a conventional one-way system 3-lane road into a Double-T grid 2-lane road, which would free up space for dedicated and protected cycle lanes on each side of the road. And having bidirectional cycle lanes would mean that these users have no extra distances to cover. Speaking about other road users, it's time I got back to the issue of pedestrian safety. Now, this is a big topic that could easily warrant a video on its own, but I'll try to be brief. So we've seen that the Double-T junction is very much not a traditional intersection. Because it's so different, it means we need to rethink how we make intersections safer for pedestrians. To start with then, how is the Double-T junction different from a traditional pedestrian crossing? For one, the traffic will always be approaching the pedestrians from the same direction. With a conventional one-way intersection, on some of the pedestrian crossings, you have to check for approaching traffic from 2 different directions. Then, as I mentioned before, we could get away with fewer traffic lanes, so that means that pedestrians will have to cross fewer lanes of traffic to cross at an intersection. and having a smaller area where pedestrians are exposed to traffic should make crossings safer. Now, apart from those differences, the Double-T junction gives us 3 distinct options for crossing the intersection, each with their own pros and cons. The first of these is the traditional crossing points option. With this option, pedestrians cross the road pretty much where they would at the moment. All we're doing is changing the direction of the traffic. Because the pedestrian crossing structures are in the same place that they are, it should require fewer alterations than the other options I'm going to look at, so it should work out cheaper to implement. On the downside then, as you'll see, this arrangement does not take full advantage of the possibilities. The next main option then is to have a new type of elevated crossing that can take advantage of the fact that with a Double-T junction, it's safe to put support pillars right in the center of the intersection. Doing this makes the elevated crossing more efficient. Elevated sections can be shorter, and the unsupported spans are also shorter because they have to cross only one lane of traffic. But while this option would be an improvement on conventional elevated crossings, you still can't get around the disadvantages of accessibility, cost, and space required. So we'll move on to the last option. And that is to have a ground level crossing via the center of the intersection. With this option, we do seem to have a few advantages. To start with, we have the ability to stop the lanes of traffic individually. We could stop 1, 2, 3, or all 4 lanes. Next, it means that pedestrians can cross just a single lane of traffic at a time, which also means that at most they're only ever half a traffic lane away from safety. Normally, if a pedestrian is crossing to the opposite corner, they would have to cross 4 lanes of traffic in total. This would be reduced down to just 2 lanes. And finally, the area where pedestrians are exposed to traffic is reduced. So, as you can probably imagine from looking at the list, I'm a fan of crossing via the centre, but does this approach have any disadvantages? Well, yes, to start with, it needs more infrastructure changes like curbs and barriers, and probably new traffic lights. After that, there are some potential problems with pedestrian traffic visibility. Now, that's an important issue, and I'll look into it in more detail. Initially then, it may seem like traffic visibility could be a problem, and visibility is closely related to the idea of the turning radius. So firstly, what is the turning radius? Well, it's all about how sharp your turn is. A low turning radius gives you a sharper turn, which means cars need to slow down more. A higher turning radius gives vehicles wider turns, which will mean that they won't need to slow down as much, and they can carry more speed around a corner. And that's important for consistent traffic speeds and for fuel efficiency. As you can probably imagine, with a conventional intersection, sharp turns and slower traffic make things safer for pedestrians. So why is that? Well, one of the scenarios where it can make a difference is when a driver or a pedestrian makes an error. Either the pedestrian crosses when they shouldn't, or the driver proceeds through the intersection when they shouldn't. Well, if the driver's view around a corner is hindered, they might be going too fast to stop in time. So for this type of scenario, it would be safer for pedestrians if the turns were tighter. But that causes the traffic to slow down more. And on the flip side, it reduces the chances of a serious accident. Now, that's okay for conventional intersections, but a Double-T grid will mean that drivers take a lot more turns. So it would be useful if they didn't have to slow down too much at every intersection. So if the reason why they make the corner sharper is because of things like visibility, what can we do to the Double-T junction to give drivers and pedestrians better visibility without having to make the turns as tight? Well, what we can do is we can move the position of the central crossing slightly so that the pedestrians will get a better view of the oncoming traffic, and of course the drivers get a better view of the pedestrians crossing from a much greater distance. Now, it's probably a very minor inconvenience for pedestrians, but I think it's one that benefits their safety greatly, because now drivers can never be surprised by rounding a corner and seeing a pedestrian trying to cross the road. And it should also benefit drivers because we can have turns with a higher turning radius. Moving on then, in this next section, I'm going to talk about some issues relating to the built infrastructure that would be needed for Double-T Grid. Now I know I'm getting way ahead of myself in this section, but I think it's important to have answers for a few of these questions ahead of time. We've seen that a Double-T grid is a new type of road network with higher throughput roads and intersections, but at some point our Double-T grid is going to end and traffic will have to interact with the more conventional road network. So how do we get enough traffic from our conventional roads into our Double-T grid? Well, if you choose the right street to start on, you'll find that a Double-T grid blends into a traditional one-way system really well. But there is one problem with this configuration though. A two-lane road in a conventional one-way system is not able to feed in enough traffic to fully utilize the roads in a Double-T grid. Then, on the other side, a two-way road in a one-way system does not have the capacity to remove enough traffic from the Double-T grid to keep the Double-T grid free flowing. One thing that can be done though is to add a few extra lanes at strategic points so that more traffic can be allowed to build up. Next, how about interfacing a Double-T grid with two-way traffic? Again, this is nothing new really. We're just going from a road with two-way traffic to a road with one-way traffic, something that's pretty common in big cities. But there are a couple of intersections that are particularly useful, and I cover these in another video of mine where I look at a lot of varieties of the Double-T junction idea, which include mixing in some two-way roads. So check that video out if you want to see more. So if a city were to change to using a Double-T grid, what are the things they need to consider? I'm not qualified to be able to put a price tag on these changes, and besides, different cities can have wildly different costs. But we at least need a basic handle on what the costs would be before any changes can be considered. Surveying and planning. Everything, of course, will start off with surveying and planning. Ground level changes. That's the first piece of manual work. Things like moving or altering curbs or the road or sidewalk levels. Cost of Double-T junction barriers. Now, these barriers are going to be very important to keep vehicles from hitting each other, but it's also a good idea to have some to protect pedestrians as well. Traffic lights. For traffic lights, it might be possible to reuse existing traffic lights and apply different timings to them, but also new ones might be required. Road markings. I can't see any road surface markings being reused for the most part. The old ones will need to be removed and new ones applied. Not just in the intersection area, but probably in the roads approaching the intersections as well. Signage. Again, it may be possible to keep some existing road signs, but many will probably need to be decommissioned and new ones installed. And then the miscellaneous costs. There's a lot of less tangible costs. Things like map alterations, public awareness campaigns, and that kind of thing. Okay, so we can see that's not going to be cheap. So how can we justify this kind of expense? Well, we would have faster travel times. Having people moving around the city more quickly, be that in a private car, bus, or taxi, is a big benefit. More predictable and consistent journey times. Then it becomes impossible to block an intersection in a Double-T grid, and because of the lower average traffic light stops, that should mean that journeys across the cities should become more predictable and consistent. Increased efficiency. Both of these factors then will mean that any kind of business that relies on the road network should benefit, be that moving goods more quickly or servicing larger areas from fewer locations. Improved safety. Now, the safety aspect is a difficult one to quantify. There's a very significant human side to traffic accidents, of course, but I'll just look at it from the financial perspective. Minor accidents are no real drain on economies. The driver or insurance company loses a bit of money, but the local repair shop gets some extra business. Serious accidents, though, are very costly to an economy in a number of ways, including medical bills, legal bills, loss of working time, sick pay, material damage, and increased insurance costs, and so on. concessions. Now, this is an idea I had when I saw that having a Double-T junction frees up a significant amount of space in the middle of an intersection. This space could perhaps be used to amortize the cost of building the intersection by using it for things like advertising or some type of concession stand or kiosk. The amount of space available very much depends on the type of roads being used and the city regulations. So I'm not sure how far we can go with this, but with enough space, it's a real possibility. Time to leave this section then, but before I do, I think it's very important to note that the infrastructure changes are dominated by one-off costs, whereas the benefits are all long-term ongoing benefits. Just a few points on this topic then, because I'm getting really far ahead of myself. Very briefly, how would we roll out a Double-T grid across a city? Well, the first thing to point out is that many cities have already made significant changes to their traffic systems when they moved from having a two-way traffic system on every street to a one-way traffic system. So a change of this magnitude is not without precedent. Speaking of one-way systems, it is possible to use a step-by-step approach converting a city from a one-way system to a Double-T grid. You could start out by changing just 4 streets around a single city block. This gives you 4 Double-T junctions and essentially a mini Double-T grid. Then you can expand this Double-T grid in any direction you like by converting another city block. So the Double-T grid can be built up gradually. Now, it would probably be less confusing for drivers if you converted sections of a city at a time, not just a couple of city blocks. But my point is that a rollout can be done in stages, and you can define how big those stages are. Finally, we know that the Double-T grid will need some type of built infrastructure to make it safe. But that doesn't mean we have to endure endless construction time. With enough surveying and planning, we can save a lot of time by prefabricating much of these barriers and built infrastructure before they are actually required. So that's almost it from me. Time to start wrapping things up, but first a word about what the future holds for cities and traffic. The first thing that you don't need a crystal ball to predict is that cars and eventually vans and trucks are rapidly starting to use batteries and electric engines. Now, electric cars with their regenerative braking tend to be better at stop-start driving than combustion engine cars, so it's possible they won't benefit as much as combustion engine cars from a fuel efficiency perspective. The next thing I'm going to mention here is that cars are going to get better at driving themselves in the future. I have no idea when fully self-driving cars will become a thing, but what we do have at the moment is a number of technologies for helping cars stay in their lanes and for making lane changes easier for drivers. And we already have some cars that can change lanes fully automatically. These types of technologies should be quite beneficial for a Double-T grid. One thing that we know for sure is that, global pandemics aside, traffic congestion is predicted to get worse. Average city driving speeds are dropping annually. Big cities are getting even bigger, and for the road network that means more vehicles. And without some radical changes, that is going to mean more congestion. And congestion is already a very expensive problem. But I hope that I've shown here that these new ideas could be part of a solution. The overarching goal of this video was to have a single resource to point to if people are having a problem with a specific aspect of the Double-T junction or grid. So hopefully by now I've answered, or at least acknowledged, most of the common problems that people might have with these ideas. I know I didn't cover everything, and I know I've oversimplified a lot of issues, and I could have gotten into a lot more detail in many other areas, but I hope I at least covered the basics. The base of these ideas, the Double-T junction, is just an arrangement for when two roads meet. It has lanes, traffic lights, pedestrian crossings, and so on. So, in one way, it might seem to people like it's nothing really new, and that the old criticisms might still apply. But when you look closer, I think people will discover that it's a new road network building block that people can use in whatever way they think. Next, I'd hate to see these ideas being used inappropriately. If people think that these ideas mean we can avoid other types of city improvements, then they've gotten the wrong idea. They can and should be used to complement other types of improvements. So I understand that the ideas behind this video are not intuitive, and that some people are going to grasp the ideas quickly, while others will take longer. These are some deeply ingrained precepts that I'm trying to overturn here, so feel free to let the ideas marinate for a while before taking another look. Next then, I think the best way to convince yourself that these ideas can actually work is to try them out for yourself. I've got another video on the Double-T Junction in the city simulator, Cities Skylines, so just watch that, set up a simulated city with a conventional traffic system and see how the traffic flows, then change to a Double-T grid and see what happens. Hopefully though, I've shown that a lot of the initial concerns that people might have either don't apply or don't apply as much as they think they might. That still though leaves us with a few legitimate problems and concerns, but I think none of them are showstoppers. And there are also a few gaps in knowledge that could be fleshed out with a bit of work. So from here, I hope that I gave people a balanced look at the major topics involved. Perhaps, though, there's something I left out that you think is important. If so, check out some of my other videos on this topic. Each video has a different focus and approaches the topic from a different perspective, so the approach I use in one of the other videos might appeal to you better. Now, I'm not really a YouTube content creator. I just enjoyed sharing some of my wacky intersection creations on my YouTube channel, and it wasn't very often I ended up with something that I think could work out in the real world. But this time, I think I did. But if you don't, instead of giving this video just a straightforward downvote, I'd prefer it if people could express how they feel in the comments. And if you disagree with a particular point or points, let me know specifically which ones you disagree with. Or if someone has already expressed your viewpoint, just upvote their comment, so I'll notice it more easily. Because now I've reached a point where I need feedback, so I hope to make a follow-up video in the future where I can respond to people's questions and concerns, because right now I have no idea what people are going to make of this idea. That's pretty much it for me then. I know this video in particular has been long and meandering as I try to cover a wide variety of different topics, but thanks for persevering. I do hope I've opened some minds to a few new possibilities. Okay, until next time, and thanks for watching.